The wind howled like a banshee across the desolate plains, whipping snow into a blinding frenzy. Now, alone and abandoned amidst this frozen, indifferent wilderness, that faint spark of hope felt like a cruel jest. Her satchel, containing the few remnants of her former life and a handful of stale biscuits, lay beside her, a pathetic testament to her isolation. The biscuits were gone, the water skin frozen solid hours ago. Fear, cold and sharp, clawed at her throat. She was accustomed to hardship, to the quiet indignities of an orphan's life. But this was a stripping away of even the pretense of safety, a raw confrontation with mortality under an unforgiving sky. She squeezed her eyes shut, picturing the warm, albeit strict, orphanage, the quiet libraries, anything but the endless white and the gnawing emptiness in her belly. Each gust of wind seemed to carry the whispers of her own impending end. She wasn't built for this. Her hands were soft from stitching and turning pages, not calloused from survival. Yet, a stubborn, almost defiant refusal to succumb flickered within her. She had endured loss, betrayal, and loneliness before. She would endure this, too, for as long as her frail body allowed. A sound, distinct from the wind's shriek, reached her ears, the crunch of hooves on snow, faint at first, then growing louder. Hope, fragile and terrifying, surged through her. She tried to call out, but her voice was a weak rasp. She pushed herself forward, crawling to the edge of the overhang, peering into the swirling white. A figure emerged from the storm, a man on a powerful, dark horse. He was heavily cloaked, hat pulled low, a part of the harsh landscape rather than alien to it. He reined in the horse, his gaze sweeping the area, sharp and assessing. It landed on her huddled form, and for a long moment, he simply observed. There was no immediate rush, no outward show of concern, just a still, silent contemplation that was both unnerving and, strangely, commanding. He was the wealthy rancher the letter had mentioned, Silas Blackwood, though she hadn't expected him to find her himself, or look quite so formidable. His stillness in the chaos was a stark contrast to her own desperate vulnerability. He dismounted slowly, deliberately, his movements economical. He didn't speak, just approached, his presence a solid, unyielding force against the storm's fury. She watched him, her heart hammering against her ribs, unsure if this was salvation or merely a different kind of danger. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes, dark and unreadable beneath the brim of his hat, met hers. The silence stretched, heavy with the storm's roar and her own desperate need. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, rough-edged, barely audible over the wind, yet carrying an undeniable authority. "You're a long way from anywhere, girl." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, as bleak and uncompromising as the landscape itself. He didn't offer platitudes or express surprise at finding a lone woman half-frozen under a rock. Silas Blackwood simply assessed the situation with the detached practicality of someone who lived by the land's brutal rules. He saw the blue lips, the chattering teeth, the glazed eyes that held a spark of fight despite the obvious despair. "Can you stand?" he asked, his voice lacking warmth but not entirely devoid of a quiet expectation. Alara tried to push herself up, her limbs stiff and unresponsive. She stumbled, and his arm shot out, catching her firmly by the elbow. His touch was rough but steady, preventing her fall. He didn't pull her close or offer comfort, merely kept her upright until she found her footing, albeit shakily. He bent, scooped up her satchel, and led her towards his horse. Getting onto the animal was a struggle she wouldn't have managed alone. He seemed to anticipate her every clumsy movement, offering a silent hand, boosting her up with surprising strength. Once she was settled precariously in front of him, he swung himself up behind her. The heat radiating from his body was a sudden, almost overwhelming relief against the pervasive cold. He adjusted the reins, his arms coming around her but not touching her, a necessary proximity without intimacy. He urged the horse forward, turning back the way he had come. The ride felt endless, the wind still tearing at them, But now she was shielded, cocooned in a fragile bubble of warmth against the storm. She could feel the steady rhythm of the horse beneath them, the solid presence of the man behind her. She didn't dare speak, didn't dare move more than necessary. His silence was absolute, broken only by the horse's snorts and the wind's shriek. She wondered about the family, about the governess position she was meant to fill. Was he taking her there? Had something happened to them? The uncertainty was a dull ache beneath her fear and exhaustion. They arrived at the ranch just as the last light faded, a cluster of sturdy buildings huddled against the vast, empty expanse. The main house was large and solid, smoke curling from its chimneys, a beacon of warmth in the frozen twilight. He dismounted first, then reached up to help her down. Her legs protested, weak and trembling. He held her arm until she was steady, then led her towards the house. The door opened before they reached it, revealing a stern-faced housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, whose eyes widened slightly at the sight of Alara, snow-dusted and disheveled, leaning heavily on Mr. Blackwood. "Found her out on the North Trail," Silas stated, his voice flat, offering no further explanation. Mrs. Gable, a woman of formidable presence, simply nodded, her expression unreadable. "Bring her in, sir. She'll freeze out here." Inside, the heat from a large fireplace was instantaneous and glorious. Alara sank onto a chair, shivering uncontrollably as the warmth met the deep cold in her bones. Mrs. Gable bustled forward, bringing a thick blanket and a steaming mug of tea. Silas remained standing by the door, shedding his coat, his gaze on Alara, assessing. He hadn't offered a single word of welcome or explanation about her intended position. It was as if her presence was a puzzle he was quietly trying to solve. The house was clean, sparsely but functionally furnished, reflecting a sense of purpose and lack of unnecessary adornment, much like the man himself. As the warmth returned to her limbs, a wave of exhaustion washed over her. She clutched the mug, the simple act feeling profoundly significant. She was safe for now, but the silence from Silas Blackwood, the unspoken questions hanging in the air, were almost as chilling as the storm outside. She was a stranger in a strange, silent house, her fate resting with a man as remote and formidable as the mountains that ringed the horizon. The days that followed were a study in quiet observation and tentative existence. Alara remained in the large, silent house. There was no mention of governess duties or, indeed, of the family she was meant to teach. Mrs. Gable, taciturn and efficient, saw to her physical needs but offered little in the way of conversation or explanation. Alara learned that Silas Blackwood lived alone save for the housekeeper and a few ranch hands she sometimes saw from the window. He was a man of routine, rising before dawn, spending his days on the vast ranch, returning at dusk. Their interactions were minimal, limited to brief, polite exchanges over dinner, where Silas ate in silence, his attention seemingly miles away. Alara, initially intimidated by his quiet intensity, began to observe him, finding a strange comfort in his predictable presence. He was not unkind, merely distant. He provided food, shelter, warmth, the basic necessities she had so desperately lacked, without asking for anything in return, at least not in words. Slowly, tentatively, Alara began to make herself useful. She helped Mrs. Gable with the household chores, her movements initially clumsy, growing more confident with practice. She wasn't expected to, but the need to feel she wasn't a complete burden, a stray taken in out of obligation, was strong. Silas noticed. He didn't comment, but sometimes, when she was sweeping or setting the table, she would feel his gaze on her, steady and evaluating. One evening, she found a box of dusty, forgotten books in a disused parlor. To her delight, they were classics, worn but precious. She spent hours poring over them, the familiar world of literature a balm to her lonely spirit. Silas found her there one afternoon, sunlight streaming through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing around her as she read. He paused in the doorway, a silent sentinel. "You read?" he asked, the first unsolicited personal question he had directed at her. "Yes, sir," she replied, feeling a blush rise. I find comfort in them, he nodded slowly, a flicker of something unreadable in his dark eyes. He didn't say more, just moved on. But the moment felt significant, a tiny bridge built between them. The winter deepened, isolating the ranch further. The work outside became harder, the days shorter. Alara saw the toll it took on Silas and the hands. The quiet challenges of survival in this harsh land were constant. Mending fences against drifting snow, caring for the livestock in brutal temperatures, ensuring supplies lasted. Alara, confined mostly to the house, felt a growing respect for the quiet strength and relentless effort required to live here. She continued helping Mrs. Gable, and sometimes, seeing the men come in from the cold, she would heat water for them, or help prepare extra food. She did these things quietly without seeking recognition, simply because they needed doing. One evening, Silas came in, his face etched with fatigue, his shoulder bandaged. A steer had bolted in the deep snow, and he'd taken a fall. He dismissed it curtly, but Alara, seeing his stiffness and the way he favored his arm, heated water and prepared a clean bandage without being asked. She approached him later, hesitantly. "Sir, perhaps I could rebandage it for you? Mrs. Gable is asleep." He looked at her for a long moment, his gaze penetrating. Then, with a curt nod, he sat down. As she worked, her fingers gentle but steady despite a slight tremor, she felt the hard muscle beneath his skin, the tension in his body. The air between them was thick with unspoken things. She finished, securing the bandage neatly. "Thank you," he murmured, the words almost lost in the crackling fire. It was the most he had ever expressed. In the shared silence of that moment, something shifted, a quiet acknowledgement passing between the rescuer and the rescued. No longer just a burden and a provider, but two people sharing the weight of existence in a lonely place. Spring arrived slowly, reluctantly, melting the snow into treacherous mud. With the change in season came visitors, the first Alara had seen other than ranch hands. A neighboring rancher, a boisterous man named Jedediah Cobb, arrived with his wife. Alara was present, pouring coffee, a quiet shadow as she had been for months. Cobb, however, noticed her. His eyes lingered a moment too long. "Didn't know you had company, Silas?" he boomed, a wide, unsettling grin on his face. "Who's the pretty little thing?" Silas's expression, usually impassive, hardened almost imperceptibly. "She's staying here," he said, his voice low and definite, offering no details. Cobb's smile didn't waver, but his eyes became calculating. "Staying? Well now, hear tell you were expecting a governess last fall. She ain't much for teachin', is she?" He chuckled, a coarse sound that made Alara instinctively flinch. She felt a wave of shame, the unspoken judgment hanging heavy in the air. Cobb's wife tittered nervously. Silas's posture straightened, becoming dangerously still. "She is under my roof, Cobb," he said, his voice losing its low tone, becoming sharp and cold as ice. "That is all you need to know." The implied threat was clear. Cobb, despite his bluster, seemed to understand, though a flicker of resentment crossed his face. He steered the conversation away, but the seed of gossip had been planted. Alara excused herself shortly after, her cheeks burning. Later, Silas found her in the parlor, looking out the window at the muddy yard. "He meant no harm," Silas said, though his tone suggested he knew otherwise. "Some men just lack breeding." It was the closest he had come to defending her. A small, quiet act of protection that meant more than lavish praise. Their days fell into a rhythm again, but the outside world had intruded. The unspoken question of her position, of her future, felt more pressing. One afternoon, Silas found her reading the dusty books again. He sat in the chair opposite her, a rare moment of shared stillness during the day. "The family I was meant to serve," Alara began, her voice quiet, looking at the book in her lap. "Did you know them?" Silas was silent for a long moment. "They were not well suited to this life," he finally said. "They left last autumn." Before you were due to arrive, the simple statement explained everything and nothing. They had abandoned the ranch, abandoned her arrival. She had been traveling towards an empty promise. A wave of complex emotions washed over her: relief that she hadn't failed, sadness for the unknown family, and a renewed sense of being utterly adrift, saved only by chance. "Oh," was all she could manage. Silas watched her, his gaze steady. "You've made a place for yourself here, Alara," he said, using her name, another small, significant step. "You are not a burden." The directness of his words was startling. I want to contribute," she said, finding her voice. "I can read and write. I can manage accounts. Perhaps I could help with the ranch books." It was a desperate offer, a plea for purpose. Silas considered this, his gaze thoughtful. The ranch accounts were notoriously neglected. "Perhaps," he allowed, a faint hint of something that might have been approval in his eyes. And so, she began to help, bringing order to the jumbled ledgers, her sharp mind finding a new application. Their shared work on the accounts created a different kind of connection, a collaboration built on intellect and trust, a quiet partnership forming in the heart of the isolated ranch. She was no longer just the rescued girl, but a valued part of the household, her resilience finding root in this unlikely ground. Summer brought a brief, intense beauty to the plains, the wildflowers blooming in defiance of the land's harshness. It also brought increased tensions. Jedediah Cobb's resentment simmered, fueled by gossip and Silas's refusal to be drawn into neighborly chats about Alara. Cobb saw Silas's protectiveness as a challenge, and Alara's presence as an opportunity to needle the stoic rancher. The climax arrived not with a storm, but with calculated cruelty. Cobb, knowing Silas was away checking distant fences, rode to the ranch with a few of his men. Mrs. Gable was in town for supplies, leaving Alara alone, working on the accounts in the quiet house. Cobb's men blocked the road, preventing anyone from reaching the house. Cobb himself approached the front door, dismounting with that same unsettling grin. Alara heard the horses and the loud voices. Her heart leaped into her throat. She knew instinctively this was trouble. She went to the door, opening it cautiously. Cobb stood there, flanked by two burly men. "Well now, little lady," Cobb drawled, tipping his hat mockingly. "Silas ain't home. Thought I'd pay a neighborly call. See how you're settling in." His eyes swept over her in a way that made her skin crawl. Fear, cold and sharp, returned, but it was different this time. It was laced with a fierce protectiveness for the quiet life she had built here, for the man who had given her refuge. "Mr. Blackwood is expected back shortly," she said, her voice trembling slightly but holding steady. "You'll have to come back then," Cobb chuckled. "Don't see why we should. Looks like you could use some company. Maybe we could show you how real ranch folk live." He took a step forward. Suddenly, Alara saw the strength she had forged in months of quiet survival. She remembered the biting cold she had endured, the loneliness she had overcome. She was not the helpless girl huddled under a rock anymore. She was Alara, who had found her footing in this brutal land. She didn't step back. Instead, she straightened her spine, meeting his gaze directly. "This is private property, Mr. Cobb," she stated, her voice gaining strength. "You are not welcome here. Leave now." Cobb's grin faltered, replaced by surprise, then anger. His men shifted restlessly. Just then, a shout echoed from the road. "Get away from the house, Cobb!" Silas, dust-covered and weary, rode towards them, his face grim, the ranch hands fanning out behind him. He had seen Cobb's men blocking the road, knew something was wrong. Cobb hesitated, caught off guard. He clearly hadn't expected Silas back so soon. Silas dismounted, walking slowly towards them, his presence radiating controlled fury. His eyes were fixed on Cobb. "You have business here, Cobb?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Or are you just harassing the womenfolk when a man's back is turned?" Cobb backed down, muttering excuses, his bravado evaporating under Silas's steady, unwavering gaze. He and his men retreated, casting resentful glances back. Alara watched them go, her heart still pounding, but a wave of relief and something else, a profound sense of belonging washing over her. Silas turned to her. He didn't ask if she was all right, didn't offer comfort. He simply looked at her, his eyes searching. He saw not the trembling girl, but the woman who had faced down a threat with quiet courage. A subtle shift occurred in his expression, a deepening of respect. Later that evening, after the ranch hands had been thanked and dismissed, and Mrs. Gable had returned, blissfully unaware of the confrontation, Elara and Silas sat by the fire. The silence between them was different now, heavy with unspoken understanding. Silas finally spoke. "You stood your ground. It wasn't a compliment, just an observation." But his tone held a warmth she hadn't heard before. I wasn't going to let him," she replied, her voice still a little shaky. It's the closest I've had to a home in a long time." Silas looked into the fire. "It is your home, Elara," he said quietly, definitively. The simple declaration hung in the air, filling the space with possibility. She had arrived a cold, lost orphan, stripped bare by circumstance. He had found her, a stoic, solitary figure in a harsh land, offering refuge without expectation. Their connection had been forged not in grand gestures or passionate declarations, but in quiet observation, shared challenges, and the slow, steady build of trust in a place that demanded resilience. She had found strength she didn't know she possessed, purpose in the forgotten books and neglected ledgers, and a quiet belonging in the silence of the ranch. He had perhaps, in his own way, found a partner, a quiet counterpoint to his solitude, someone who saw beyond the formidable exterior to the man beneath. They made no grand pronouncements that night, no sudden confessions. That wasn't their way. Their love, when it finally bloomed in the fertile ground of their shared history, was like the wildflowers of the prairie, resilient, unexpected, and rooted deep in the land. It was a love built on mutual respect, quiet understanding, and the shared commitment to carving a life out of the wilderness. Elara, the orphaned governess, and Silas Blackwood, the solitary rancher, together, they didn't just build a life. They built a legacy, a testament to the strength found in partnership, the warmth discovered in the coldest places, and the history written not in grand pronouncements, but in the quiet, enduring story of two souls finding home in each other's steadfast presence. The ranch, once a symbol of her isolation, became the heart of their world, a place where resilience bloomed and love, quiet but profound, finally found its home.